From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, welcome to this special program as Brazil decides upon its political future. I'm Soini Gray.
And I'm Ian Bruce.
For the next hour, we'll be following and discussing this vital election in Brazil, one that the experts have described as the most uncertain and important in years. We're going to have a number of guests from Brazil. First, Eduardo Silva of the Workers' Party joins us from Sao Paulo. And we're also being joined by Miriam Adelman, who teaches sociology at the University of Paraná in Curitiba. That's Miriam there. And that's, of course, where the former president, Lula da Silva, is being held in prison. So, Ian, why is everyone saying this is one of the most important elections in years?
Well, I think it's both because it's so uncertain and because it's so different from previous elections. And I think to explain that, I think we need to jump in straight with the exit polls that we're getting now.
Yeah.
Because they are themselves quite surprising. You know, I think we have a graphic here which shows where we were at when they had 50% of the, and sorry, these are not the exit polls, these are the actually official results from the TSE.
Because I don't think we've told our guests that, well, there are 3 time zones in Brazil, and we, at least for the last time zone, we are 30 minutes since polls have closed. So we should be expecting official results, and let's see those official results now. On the screen, we have Jair Bolsonaro at, is that 40, my vision is terrible, but that is what, 48.9%?
That's right. When 57% of the vote counted, Jair Bolsonaro much higher than we expected. 48.9%, almost 49%, and Fernando Haddad on 26.3%. The other candidates well behind them.
And this is only shocking because we've been reporting the polls from Ibope and Datafolha, and they had Jair Bolsonaro more in the 30 range.
That's right, in between 30 and 35,
which
thereabouts.
meant that we were safely, we were expecting a runoff.
Absolutely. Well,
okay.
We would still go to a runoff with this because it's not indicating that any candidate will get more than 50%, which was what they would need to avoid going to runoff at the end of October.
So he needs, if Jair gets 50%, no runoff?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. But I am seeing now with 68%, with a little bit more of the vote counted, actually Jair Bolsonaro has slid back a little bit, 2 points to 46% something, and Fernando Haddad on about 25%. So still quite surprising results. And I should add that even before that, we got the exit polls for some of the other elections that are going on today, for the governor races in the 3 big states, in Sao Paulo state, in Rio de Janeiro and Minas Gerais. They all showed candidates, relatively unknown candidates from small right-wing parties, more or less allied with Jair Bolsonaro, doing surprisingly well in first place. And the PT candidates coming.
Let me stop you 1 second. Why is that so interesting? Why are smaller candidates doing so well?
Well, this is the surprise. I think it must be because of the Bolsonaro effect.
Okay.
Because they were certainly weren't expected to do.
I like the sound of
well.
that, the Bolsonaro effect. But we have our correspondent, Brian Mayer. He's in Sao Paulo. So we want to go to him a little bit to get a feel for how the actual day of voting has been so much. Brian, are you there?
Hi, how's it going?
I'm fine, Brian. Lovely seeing you. So talk to me a little bit, since this is our first show of the day, well, our first special program. How has voting been today in Brazil? Hi, Brian. Are you still there?
Well, yeah, the connection doesn't seem that good. But basically, just to continue, there's big regional differences right now. The voting for Bolsonaro was much greater than expected in the South and the Southeast. And the Northeast is holding very strong to the left. Left governors took most of the states in the Northeast, and a lot of votes from the Northeast still have to be counted. So it's really going down to the wire, but for now it looks like there's going to be a runoff.
Okay, so is there sort of a demographic difference in the South and the Southeast as to why they might be more interested in Bolsonaro? Or is that a connection that's a little tenuous at the moment?
No, there's huge regional differences. You know, traditionally Brazil's been nicknamed Bell India because the Southeast and the South have European standard of living, and the Northeast had an Indian standard of living. The Northeast is much poorer and generally votes farther left, and it's the region that most benefited from Lula's presidency and Dilma Rousseff's presidency. So it's no surprise that left candidates are hanging tough. The Communist Party governor of Maranhão, for example, was reelected with over 60% of the vote. And there's a lot of votes still coming in from Bahia. So hopefully, I hope that this goes to a runoff, frankly. It looks like it's going to now.
So just explain to us a little bit more, because what's happening with some of the other governor races and senator races in the southeast, Brian?
Well, the southeast is swinging pretty far to the right. It looks like Bolsonaro's winning Rio de Janeiro state with 59%. You know, and a lot of, like the Speaker of the Senate, not the Speaker, but the PT leader in the Senate, Lindbergh Farias, from Rio de Janeiro state, doesn't look like he's going to be reelected either. So a lot of the PT party senators and congressmen are taking hits in the South and Southeast, but luckily there's some gains being made in the Northeast at the moment.
Soini was asking just before, Brian, about what these small parties of the right that seem to be doing quite well in those governor and Senate elections, what they represent, who they are. Can you enlighten us a bit further on that?
They represent a coalition of three political blocs in Brazil: the gun lobby, the evangelical Christian right, and the ranchers and plantation owners. So it's an elite coalition that is aligned with a lot of poor evangelical Christians. And it's growing, you know. You see a lot of these candidates are using slogans from the NRA in their campaigns, like guns don't kill people, people kill people. It's a troubling trend, and it seems like there's outside influence on their growth, you know. These tiny parties didn't have the moxie to develop such toxic social media campaigns as have developed in the last couple of weeks, for example.
And how has, I had asked you earlier, but I think we had a bit of a connection problem. How has voting been today? What has the mood been at the polls?
Well, I was at the polls all day, you know, and it was somber. People weren't wearing shirts from different parties or anything. People weren't talking much. So it really left me confused as to how the outcome was going to go. In the last week or so, however, in my traveling back and forth to the periphery of São Paulo, where I live on the train, I've heard more and more working class people praising Bolsonaro, repeating information that sounded like it came right out of memes and out of WhatsApp posts and things like that, cliches. So it's troubling, you know, because they're voting against their best interest. They're voting to eliminate their vacation pay, to eliminate their 13th check, to eliminate affirmative action. It reminds me of the poor whites who voted for Trump, you know?
Now that's really interesting. Now you've noticed that they're voting against their best interests. Have they explained to you why they think this might actually be in their best interest?
Well, I talked to a neighbor of mine who voted for Bolsonaro today, and he told me that he thinks the country is such a mess. Bolsonaro is either going to fix it or he's going to just destroy everything once and for all. And so that was his rationale.
Really bleak prediction there from Brian.
It
Ian?
is indeed. It doesn't look good for the PT. And you mentioned there this question of law and order, and I think Bolsonaro has really played on this. Obviously, it's violence is not new in Brazil, but it certainly has got worse.
Yeah.
And Bolsonaro has played on that, absolutely. You know, he's played on people's worst fears, and in a situation where the political system itself has lost so much credibility, and the economic situation hasn't been good for several years, I suppose, you know, a lot of people just turn to that kind of law and order kind of rhetoric and you know, think that's the only way they're going to solve their situation.
Do we still have Brian on the line? Brian, are you there?
Yes, okay. I am, yeah.
Okay, so I wanted you to actually respond to that comment from Ian about law and order, because we've been reporting for this entire year about the state of violence in Brazil. Like one of our biggest stories was the murder of Marielle Franco, and another big story has been the militarization of security operations in Rio de Janeiro. So And Bolsonaro is a former military man. So is that part of his attractiveness? People think, well, if we get someone who has national security experience, he is going to solve the violence in Brazil. Is that one of the reasons why he is so attractive and people are sort of voting against their best interests?
Well, that's his marketing, you know. But if you look at the violence statistics, they've fluctuated wildly. I've been living in Brazil 23 years, and it's much safer now than it was 20 years ago. And Sao Paulo right now has a murder rate comparable with New York City's 7 per 100,000 residents. And that's one of the states where Bolsonaro is the most popular. Furthermore, Rio de Janeiro, where the military intervention took place, the military intervention increased the crime rate in Rio de Janeiro state. So we know that that strategy doesn't work. Even so, Rio's only about the 16th most violent state in the country. Now, there are serious problems with violence in Brazil, but it's just bizarre that Bolsonaro's anti-violence appeal would be so heavy in one of the least violent states in the country, which is Sao Paulo. So I think in a way, it's this fetish about uniforms and guns that appeals to a lot of young men. You know, it's machismo.
Thank you so much for that update. I think we might go to you a little later on in the newscast, so don't go too far. But first I have to go to my colleague Estefania Bravo for a short news update. Estefania?
No hay nada en el prompter, así que bueno. Thank you, Soyini. The polls have closed in Brazil's general election, including at the last voting centers in the far west of the country. Throughout the day, Brazilians lined up outside polling stations to take part in the most unusual and highly contested elections in recent Brazilian history. Nearly 150 million citizens were eligible to vote. The frontrunners in this race were far-right candidate Jair Bolsonaro and the Workers' Party candidate Fernando Haddad. According to the preliminary results, Brazil will go to a second runoff with 69.4% of the votes counted. Far-right candidates got a 48.4%, while Haddad achieved a 26.5%. And early this morning, Workers' Party candidate Fernando Haddad cast his ballot in Sao Paulo. The left-wing candidate is replacing former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who was barred from running. Haddad has been placed second in most opinion polls behind the far-right candidate Jair Bolsonaro, but during a highly likely runoff election, there are indications he could overtake the far-right candidate.
We've done a good job of explaining our positions in this final stretch. A lot of people were being misled, and we managed to contain this underhand campaign on social media. In a second round should help with this. In runoff, you can't hide behind social media. I've mentioned a few names, but we'll need to broaden out. Brazil is running a very great and unnecessary risk of doing away with the gains of the last 30 years. We can't run that risk. Brazilians don't deserve that. We'll have the opportunity to explain all this in the next 3 weeks and reach the end.
And for his part, far-right candidate Jair Bolsonaro cast his vote in Rio de Janeiro. Speaking to the press, Bolsonaro said he put up a good fight after being stabbed last month. He also said that he is different from the other candidates. During his campaign speeches, Bolsonaro enraged critics for supporting far-right ideas, including a military crackdown in the country.
Really, each voter should decide according to their knowledge, according to their understanding. And fake news shouldn't affect the votes that so many made against me. So, the voter, Brazilians, will become independent. We are no longer ruled by just anyone. Each voter responds to himself, and I'm very happy.
And meanwhile, Supreme Court President Rosa Weber made a first report on the conduct of the elections at lunchtime. She said, although there is always a possibility of fraud, she has total confidence in the electronic voting system. She said the elections are a celebration of citizens' rights and the maximum expression of democracy.
The elections are the most important day for democracy. Equality of the vote is paramount, where equality prevails, as in no other aspect of our lives as citizens. Each citizen, man or woman, one vote, with the same importance.
And Brazil's Attorney General Raquel Dodge also spoke at the TSE's news conference.
The Attorney General's electoral office is also playing a very active part in these elections. We have 6 members on permanent duty here at the central office, 27 regional attorneys, 1 in each of the states, 54 members looking at electoral propaganda, 3,000 judicial support staff to accompany the vote, as well as those overseeing the voting centers. So it is a big operation, which alongside the TSE has the job of making sure that the elections in this country are free and fair.
We'll have more news on Election Day later in this program. For everything on Brazil's election, you can check out our special website at telesurtv.net/English, then go to In-Depth and click on the option Brazil Elections, everything you need to know. So Yini, back to you.
Thank you so much, Estefania Bravo. Okay, so we have a guest, Eduardo Silva from the Workers' Party. So we want to go to him now because these elections, these results that are coming in already are really interesting and we need to try and navigate that. So Eduardo, very simply, what do you make of these results so far?
Well, good afternoon, first of all.
Thank you so much for joining us, yes.
Thank you. I think that regardless of the result of the election, the real damage has already been done, which is the naturalization of the speech of hatred that Bolsonaro brings into politics. But the results were quite tragic to the Brazilian democracy, as I see it.
Eduardo, really quickly, this has been a very complicated election, and the Workers' Party started with one candidate and then had to switch. Is it possible that maybe knowing the judicial, I want to word this properly, knowing the judicial system in Brazil, the Workers' Party sort of hurt itself by going so heavily with Lula, and maybe they should have made Haddad their candidate from the beginning? Is that a strategic mistake?
I wouldn't say it's a strategic mistake because we must remember that Lula would win the election in the first round, and he had to switch because there was a judicial battle, and we are going in Brazil, which indicates that we have a judicial rupture. So we're not actually in a democratic society right now. Because the judicial branch has been acting politically, and Lula's prison is political. So the strategy of keeping his name in the ballot, I believe it was correct because we were able to tension through the whole campaign, use Lula's popularity, and now we can see that Haddad is probably going to make it to the runoff, even though he had a very short campaign.
That's true, and that's actually really interesting, considering how short his campaign was, his actual face and presence. He's been doing really, really well. And we know that you need to win 50% of the vote to get to, well, to eliminate the runoff, and the statistics are saying that we are expecting to go to the second round. So but talk to me a bit about how Election Day was today and how y'all are feeling about these results, because we are quite frankly a little bit shocked because the polls prior to the election suggested much less favoritism for Bolsonaro. So we're a little surprised that he's getting so close to 50.
Yes, well, the election day, considering the situation, it was pretty calm. I think there were like a few arrests, but this is something that happens in all elections. Uh, it was quite calm. There are some cases of aggressions against activists from the Workers' Party who were wearing a red T-shirt or even a label of their candidates. And we regrettably we had also some electors from Bolsonaro who used a gun to vote to actually push the numbers in the ballot and made videos and posted it on the internet. So this is the current situation. It's a naturalization of a speech of hate and violence that is being going on in Brazil.
Eduardo, I mean, we've been talking a lot about Bolsonaro, and obviously for obvious reasons. But you mentioned there, I mean, it does still look almost certain that it will go to a runoff. So how do you think Fernando Haddad will handle the next 3 weeks leading up to the second round? Will he make adjustments? Will he reach out to other sectors? What will he be doing? And what will you be doing in the PT?
Yes, no, of course, we will be reaching out to other sectors, especially from PDT, Ciro Gomes, who is in third place right now, and also Boulos, who is from PSOL. So we are looking forward to gather all the popular democratic field and gather all these votes and create a huge campaign for Haddad in the runoff. I think Haddad will have to be a little bit more aggressive. He has been very calm so far, and I think a little bit of a push would be appropriate in the current situation.
Obviously, it's early days. You know, we're halfway through the announcement of the results. But I mean, and they are a bit of a shock. But do you feel confident that Haddad and the PT can do that job of bringing those sectors together and actually climbing past Bolsonaro in the second round?
I think eventually the Brazilian population will come into a sense that because many of these votes that are going for Bolsonaro were votes that would go to Lula if he had been the candidate. Some parts of the electors of Bolsonaro, they represent distrust in politics. It's like, oh, since Lula is not going to be a candidate, I will vote for Bolsonaro. This is something that one could say that it doesn't make sense, but for these electors, it's like that there is this disbelief in the political system because of the way that things have been handled in the past few years with the coup d'etat against Dilma and the illegal prison and the political prison of Lula. So there is a huge disbelief, and that's part of this shocking outcome of the ballots is due to. Is a protest against elections. It's like voting for the worst candidate or the one that says that he is against the system, but obviously he's not against the system. You have the whole MDB party, which is the biggest party in numbers of congressmen and women, and who is supporting him. So he is the mainstream candidate right now. And I think eventually the Brazilian population will come to a sense.
Thank you, Eduardo. I want to bring Miriam Adelman into the conversation. She teaches sociology at the University of Parana, which is in Curitiba. And Curitiba is important because that's where Lula da Silva is based. He's being held in prison there. Miriam, are you hearing me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you and I can see you. Thank you so much for joining us. So since you teach sociology, let's talk about some of the stuff that Eduardo was just commenting on, because this is very unusual. The character of the election is very unusual. The voters seem to be not very impassioned, so we're a little concerned about the results. And also, Eduardo was saying something that I thought really interesting, and I wanted to know if I can use you to explain it. He said, persons who were going to vote for Lula, since Lula is no longer available, are voting for Bolsonaro. Now, they are polar opposite candidates. How does that happen?
Excuse me?
Sorry. I have a strong accent, so let me repeat.
No.
Eduardo,
Listen, but I was
Eduardo said,
volunteering another- Okay, you could repeat it.
okay, Eduardo said that persons who were voting for Lula have decided that they will vote for Jair Bolsonaro. That's a bit unusual because they're polar opposites politically. So I wanted to know if you could help us make sense of that.
Okay, well, this is still speculative. I mean, I don't have any research before me that actually confirms that. But it is true that the masses of there are many poor people and working class people in Brazil who have what we would say is uh, low levels of political capital. That means that they have not had a good education. They don't have much of a notion of history. They are very susceptible to emotional discourse, to manipulation, which has been very strong coming from the media. And people are frightened. The situation in the country is tense. There's been a lot of unemployment. There's a general scenario which makes it easy for emotional discourse to produce that kind of change and shift, especially when people don't have convictions that are based on strong convictions that are based on knowledge of history. So I would, in that sense, perhaps it's not so surprising. I mean, a lot of people are speaking about how the conditions in Brazil today are very similar to what they were in Germany with the rise of fascism. And I definitely think that there are parallels, just large masses of frustrated, uh, impoverished, or impoverished working people, and people who are disaffected, who aren't unsure about their place in society. And I know that a lot of people were actually counting on women because one quite positive phenomena has been the resurgence or perhaps the emergence of a feminist movement, particularly among young women, one that I've been living in Brazil since 1991. And this is a movement that really began to take shape in the year 2000s, around the year 2000, particularly among young women. And so, since young women have been a very strong voice coming out and criticizing, manifesting their disagreement, their anger, their frustration, their disgust with Bolsonaro's homophobic and misogynist discourse, his total disrespect for women, kind of a speech that legitimates rape, then young women in particular, have been a great hope to turn this around, or perhaps even to give shape to a kind of amorphous discontent that extreme right-wing discourse might be able to use in its own favor. So, this has been very important. At the same time, Brazil has feminism, although it has been gaining ground in Brazil, has never enjoyed as much popular support as it has in perhaps certain European countries or in the United States, or even
Miriam, let me interject a second. Let me interject a moment because I had mentioned in my introduction that you are at the University of Parana, which is based in Curitiba. So I wanted to know, what has it been like for you experiencing the election there from your base in Curitiba? Because, of course, the Workers' Party initial candidate, former President Lula da Silva is based in a prison there. So what has the political atmosphere been in Curitiba? What have you experienced?
Okay, well, it has been very, very tense. And Curitiba has been known as a conservative city. And the south of Brazil, of course, is a more conservative region of the country than the Northeast. I would say, because I'm a university professor, and in that regard, I've been privileged because I'm among many young people who are being mobilized by desire and hopes for change, perhaps to a certain extent it is easy. It has been easy from my position to overestimate the vigor of these young people, uh, of young women, of young men as well, people who are part of LGBT movements, the Black movement, people who support the indigenous peoples of the country. So, I think that yes, the atmosphere in the city has been tense, and there have been there are supporters, many, many, many supporters of right-wing conservative candidates. But at the same time, there was even a surprising amount of mobilization of young people who believe that we need another kind of alternative here, and many of them were Lula supporters who then took Haddad on as their candidate. There were others who believe that Ciro Gomez would be a good option. Others who believe that Marina da Silva represents something very different, somebody really from the outside, somebody with a platform that includes environmental issues. So yes, it's been quite hard here, but again, amongst young people, I saw a surge of something that actually I had never seen before. And I had never seen so many young people, young women, young men, and of course, supporters of all ages going onto the streets to demand respect for women's rights, demanding gender inequality, demanding respect for diversity, demanding an end to racism, demanding public education, health, and so on and so forth. So,
Miriam, I'd like to pick up on something you're talking about there, because we've been talking a lot about this, quite alarming rise in support for the far-right candidate Bolsonaro. But now you're talking about a very different thing. And it does seem to be this extraordinarily polarized situation, which was exhibited, most dramatically by those huge demonstrations just 1 week ago. I think, something in the region of 2 million people, led by women, not all women, of course, but led by women, against the rise of that. How do you see this polarization playing out?
well, it's very hard to say. It's very hard to say. I do know that if we are to, well, it's going to require a lot of effort on the part of everybody who believes in a more just and equal society over the course of the next couple of weeks. But perhaps it is possible, because something that has been widely commented on in the amongst people who consider themselves center and left of center is that there is a mass of people out there, working class people, people who live in rural environments, people who belong to more marginalized populations, and just, even lower middle class people who are not very well informed about what's going on. And I myself have had experiences in which I go onto the street and talk to people, and they've just been sort of pushed along by perhaps what somebody in the church says, or WhatsApp messages that they've received. And when you sit down and explain to people and you say, look, this candidate has a very anti-woman agenda. This is a candidate who's made public speech that actually legitimizes rape. This is somebody who just disseminates hatred, who works against a long, hard struggle to have gay and lesbian rights recognized in this country. And when we get into when we can show people also what kind of a voting record he's had on issues that affect working people's rights, then we've all had success. So just it's a matter of going out there and showing and creating over the next 2 weeks spaces in which a lot of face-to-face talk can go on in environments that are calm and more reasonable, and where emotions are just a sort of a more peaceful and a calm environment. Because
Let me
in
interrupt
the,
you.
you know,
Miriam, let me interrupt you a second because we have a really important update there on the screen. So I just want to draw our viewers' attention to it. We have 80-something% of the votes in. So right now, Jair Bolsonaro is at 47.6%, which means we're still going to a runoff, and Fernando Haddad is at 27.2%. So that is with over 80% of the votes counted so far, 86% of the votes counted so far. So Miriam, you were talking about the activism. I want to go back to that because we never explicitly spoke about the LA Now protest in Brazil against Bolsonaro's misogynistic comments. We have to talk about his anti-LGBT comments, his racist comments. They have served to, I guess, influence young people to get into politics, to be active, to be on the road, which is something that we've seen in other places where we have the rise of the right. We see civil activism rising. How do you expect this to progress in the next 2 weeks for the runoff? Because right now we seem to be heading into a runoff in Brazil.
yes. Well, I expect it to move full steam ahead. I think that a lot of people on the left have realized that there's a lot to be won on this grassroots level, going and talking to people and explaining to people who I said don't have a high level of cultural capital. So there are people who, but of course, they're smart enough to recognize that they have interest and that they have rights, and that and what is at stake. So, you know, when I do think that what we're seeing is that it's very close, that there is a lot in stake, and it could go one way or it could go the other way. But there's one other thing that I should say, and that is, one way or another, I am certainly hoping that the left and the center left are able to put enough work into this, roll up their sleeves, get out there in the community, talk to people, because it is very sad to see so many working people. The elites, people who have their class interests at stake, that's one thing, but to see ordinary working people, women, LGBT, Black members of the Black community, well, for the most part, I do believe that the so-called minorities have not voted for Bolsonaro, but to see that happens even to any small degree is a very anguishing and a very frustrating thing, but I think that there is a chance for this turnaround, and that too much has been left to WhatsApp, to major media corporations. So, there's. But again, there is one other point that I wanted to make, and that is that unfortunately a lot of damage has been done. So, even if, as I hope, the left candidate, the opposition Haddad in this case, if he does win, we are still going to need to get out there into the streets. The people who support Bolsonaro, who are already, we've seen it again and again, they're ready to use violence. They will use violence. They've been using intimidation at institutional levels.
I've been reporting on that for the day. Thank you so much, Miriam Adelman. We really appreciate your thoughts on that. But I do like that you tried to end it on a bit of optimism. But we have more guests and more discussion. But first, we have to take a really short break, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
Quilombola em Eldorado Paulista. Olha, o afrodescendente mais leve lá pesava 7 arrobas. Não fazem nada. empregaria com o meu salário. Sem problema. Mas tem muita mulher que é competente. Eu acho que essa igualdade. Olha, jamais eu tô pra você que você não merece.
Olha, eu espero que...
Welcome back. Thank you. Welcome to Brazil Decides, our Tell Us Your English's coverage of one of the most interesting and fascinating elections in Brazilian history. So we've been having a lot of conversation throughout the show so far, but I think it's really important for us to focus on the candidates. So let's turn to the Workers' Party candidate Fernando Haddad, who's been able to step into the shoes of the former president Lula da Silva. Here's a report about him from one of our correspondents in Brazil.
After the triumph of Dilma Rousseff in the last presidential election 4 years ago, the Workers' Party was attacked by the opposition. Media and elites led to the impeachment, privatizations, austerity policies, and the imprisonment of former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. The Workers' Party found in Fernando Haddad an option to replace Lula.
Lula was a good president. I vote for him. I will vote for Haddad and for the entire Workers' Party.
I will vote for Haddad because Lula was the only president who worked hard for the northern region.
I will vote for Haddad. He is ahead on the polls and we're going to win.
We are waiting for the general election. Haddad will win. He will receive the presidential sash and everything will go back to normal.
Fernando Haddad is an academic, former mayor of Sao Paulo, and former minister of education. He helped found 18 universities, 173 school campuses, and 360 federal institutes. The Workers' Party also established an education policy to give more opportunities for Black, Pardos, and indigenous people. Among his proposals are the abolition of the labor reform, a reform on social investment and privatization policies imposed by President Michel Temer. Also, a reform of the state system to establish a truth commission to investigate crimes of the dictatorship and the development of a basic food income. If Haddad wins the presidency, he will continue using Petrobras as the main axis of Brazil's economy. This was the same economic strategy used by the previous administrations of the Workers' Party.
Petrobras grew with the price policies that we used to apply. We have taken into account external prices, but in relation to their impact on product costs. However, Michel Temer has transformed Petrobras into a speculative company.
But Haddad needs to convince Lula supporters to vote for him. Lula was leading the polls until his candidacy was revoked by the Electoral Court. However, the new government program developed by Haddad has Lula's support.
It is more advanced than other economic programs presented by the Workers' Party in previous presidential elections. It contains very important structural reforms like the tax reforms and the banking reform. The tax reforms will make those who make more money pay more, and those who make less pay less. Brazil has a very aggressive tax structure. More than 60% of taxes are paid by the poorer sectors of the country.
The Workers' Party seeks to win their first presidential election since the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. The polls anticipate an eventual second round between the extreme right and the Workers' Party.
So that was a look at the Workers' Party candidate Fernando Haddad and what he represents. Now I just want to give you a quick update on the results. With 86% of the votes counted, Jair Bolsonaro 47.6. Now that's a couple of points down from what we saw right at the beginning of the official results, when it was about 50%. So he's come down a little bit.
48.
Thank you, sorry. and Haddad on 27, just over 27%. So still heading for a runoff as far as we can see, but much higher vote for Bolsonaro than any of us thought earlier in the day or in the last few days. Let's take a look at what Jair Bolsonaro represents.
He is a 62-year-old former captain in the army who defends the military dictatorship and considers torture legitimate. He has become notorious for his sexist and homophobic remarks, and he has presented himself as a messiah to save the Brazilian people. Bolsonaro has served 7 terms as a member of the lower house of the Brazilian Congress. His political platform includes a strong security agenda. It includes lowering the age of criminal responsibility to 16 and spending more on the police and intelligence services. He's also in favor of privatizing public companies.
So, that's some of the points of his agenda. But just let's be a bit more specific about some of the more outrageous remarks that Jair Bolsonaro has made. You know, he talks about, he's made extremely explicit anti-LGBT homophobic remarks. He's also explicitly defended the dictatorship, the military dictatorship. He was, of course, a captain in the army, and he's often referred to how things were better under the military dictatorship that ended in 1985. And he's also, don't think we have the right graphic up here, but he's also explicitly defended the use of torture and suggested that you never got any results by voting. A very strange position to have for somebody who's running in a presidential election, of course. So, he's presented this image of someone who's anti-establishment and anti the system which people are indeed, disillusioned with because of the corruption, because the economy hasn't been going well, and so on and so forth. But his actual core economic policies are straight down the line conventional neoliberal.
Really interesting. We did have some quotes up there. I think you didn't get a chance to talk about his that rape comment, which I find very shocking. But then, of course, I think a lot of Brazilian women did as well, because we had the LA Now protest. So that was our profile of Jair Bolsonaro, who is the far-right candidate for Brazil.
I mean, there clearly are here, two so different projects for Brazil. And it's difficult to know. I mean, we were talking about that polarization before, which is an expression in the streets and in the ballot boxes of the way Brazil has become so divided.
So let me interrupt you. Okay, so these numbers have changed very slightly. 88% of the votes counted.
Yes.
Jair Bolsonaro is at 47.3.
Yeah, very little difference there. Just a small climb up for Haddad.
Minute. Fernando Haddad at 27.5. But, because this is an election show, the numbers keep fluctuating.
And that's, as you say, 88%.
88% of the votes counted. So we're getting close to the end.
It is looking very difficult for Bolsonaro to get beyond that 50%. So it does look like we're going for a second round.
Yeah, and classic far-right examples in the results there, because the comments that he's saying, our correspondent Brian Mayer made some reference to the fact that he was seeing a lot of NRA comments, and for some viewers, NRA is the National Rifle Association in the United States, not even in Brazil, in the United States. But then that makes sense, because look who the United States has in power, and his commentary has been very far-right, very nationalistic, very emotional, very emotive stuff. He's also very sexist. He's also very racist. So there's a sort of, clearly politics right now, it's playing to the emotions. There's former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. When I was doing research for today's show, I keep remembering Basdeo Panday saying politics has a morality of its own. And I think these sort of elections really makes that true, because there's no way those comments that Jair Bolsonaro is saying it's not rational. And why are people accepting it? Because for some reason, this sort of bad behavior is the norm in politics, or it's allowed. It's not allowed outside that sphere, but it's allowed in this one. So politics really does have a morality of its own.
So, I think we've got 2 more guests joining us now from Brazil. I think we've got Ana Shah, who is from the Landless Workers Movement in Sao Paulo, and Vinicius Enrique Fontana, who's a freelance journalist who covers a lot of social movement issues, the indigenous movement, and so forth, so on. Thank you very much for joining
Anna's on
us.
screen.
Thank you.
Anna, maybe we could begin with you, because we have been talking about the Eli Now, the Not Him movement, and the way that there's this extraordinary polarization between that surge of protest against the far right that we saw just 1 week ago, and these results we're seeing now, where Bolsonaro seems to be doing better than expected. What do you make of this?
Yes, last week it was really a very, very big mobilization, mainly of women, but not just of women, about all the society. It was really powerful to see so many people, so many activists, so many militants, and not organized people also going in the streets and saying that we really don't want a president who, although it doesn't have any kind of really truly proposal for economics, for coming out of the crisis, but he's also a candidate who represents sexism, who represents homophobic, who represents a lot of behaviors against. We cannot say the minority of population, because it's the majority. Women's and Black people and indigenous are the majority part of the Brazilian population. So it was really amazing to see all that mobilizations all around the country, not just in São Paulo, but in all even the small cities. But of course, in the last weeks, because all the debate is now based on a very moral issues. Also, we had this counteract of the evangelic churches, of the right-wing candidates, just also using these moral arguments. And then we have seen also on internet a very big counterattack using all these arguments. And we truly believe that that kind of messages, and also a lot of offensive news were fake news, who were published on the social media, they had influenced a lot the people who went to vote and vote on the candidate Bolsonaro. So for us it's a surprise. It's a very, very sad surprise, because we really thought that saying no, it will be a changing on an alert to those people who still didn't know who to vote. But we realized that in the last weeks, the last week, this exactly 7 last days, so the evangelic churches and all those who were still not very decided who to support, but were from the right-wing parties, decided to make this last push on the campaign of Bolsonaro. And now we are very anxious today, but we truly believe and hope that it will be a second round, and that on the second round we will be able, the left, to make a major debate, to make a very truly debate on proposals, on concrete proposals to go behind the crisis, to make the country again to be developed. But on these last days, it was not a very fair propaganda of the projects. And what we have seen was the propagation of fake news, and a lot of people just have information from social media. So if they were still have not decided and received some kind of information from the family groups of WhatsApp or from the Facebook saying that Bolsonaro is the possibility to change Brazil against the corruption and against violence. So they somehow just received that information and accepted and went to vote and vote on him.
Anna, we want to keep you on set, but Ian Bruce, I understand that we have another guest.
Indeed,
on the show.
Vinicius Enrique Fontana. Thank you very much for joining us, Enrique. I wonder if you could broaden that out a little bit to other social movements. I know you've been doing a lot of work covering social movements. How do you think, you know, whether it's not just the landless movement, the women's movement, the indigenous movement, the Afro-descendants movement, how will there be a mobilization, a real activity of social movements in these next 3 weeks to try and reverse this rise of the far right?
Yes, good evening. I believe that we'll have some movement, especially because the abstention was very high at this point. We had 20% of abstention on voting, so people who didn't go to vote. So the mobilization now for the Workers' Party and also for social movements, it's to convince people to go and vote. Because Bolsonaro is really, I believe that he's really fixed on his level. This 47, 48 will vary a little bit, but he will not be able to really convince more people to vote from this absent. And definitely the social movements.
Can I just interrupt you there a moment, Vinicius, because what you just said there reminds me of something I heard João Pedro Stedele say just a few days ago when he said he didn't think there was a social basis for fascism in Brazil and that he didn't think that Bolsonaro could go much beyond his 32%. And now we see him already on 47%. So isn't that a little bit of a risky prediction?
Yes, I agree. But at the same time, when we look at the candidates now that run on the first round, we'll see that Ciro Gomes, the one that got the third place, and most of his votes will go definitely to Fernando Haddad. That's the Workers' Party candidate. We still have a lot of uncertainty, but in a way, social movements will try to make it more, to create a better scenario for Fernando Haddad. And there's also another thing that Bolsonaro will now have to face the audience in the debates on television, on radio, because as he got stabbed, he stayed in the hospital and he wasn't allowed by his doctors to go in front on television and give and face Haddad face by face. So there's this expectation of him being confronted with Haddad directly that he will not perform so well. So that's also a low point for him.
So Vinicius, really quickly, this has been really interesting. What would Bolsonaro, what would Haddad have to do to ensure that he can convince the rest of the population that he is worth voting for? Because we have, you know, the numbers have been close. He's had a pretty short campaign. And also we've been hearing that a lot of the voters in Brazil are pretty apathetic. And this is clearly, and people are clearly voting on emotion, not so much on evaluating facts. So, because we haven't actually spoken about the power of the evangelical church in Brazil, which is odd because, you know, their candidate is Jair Bolsonaro, who's been saying a lot of non-Christian things. So what does Haddad have to do to tap into the emotion? Because apparently this is an election where emotions are most important.
Yes, definitely. Haddad will have to try to show people that he's the most democratic way to Brazil. He is the most democratic candidate, that the Workers' Party, it's really, really trying to build democracy in Brazil stronger and stronger. And he will have to look for alliances, especially in the States, because we have this very polarized situation where the northeast of Brazil votes pro the Workers' Party, and most of the other regions, but especially the south and São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, these areas are voting pro Bolsonaro. But they also have a very high abstention rate. So maybe Fernando Haddad can try to convince people from these areas that he has a project of democracy, that that Bolsonaro is a project that will take Brazil 30 years back to a non-democratic regime, or maybe formally democratic, but not democratic in the social way. So that's what I think is very important. And to build alliances, because especially with the governors, because now it will be very difficult for him. We can see a little bit how the parliament is formed, and it's really, really conservative, especially the Senate. We still don't have a very clear situation about the lower chamber, because we have to count all the votes in all the states to have this very clear. So Haddad will really have to build these alliances with the states, especially in the Northeast, but also try to convince these people that are not going to vote, or that still are a bit undecided in the South, in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, especially.
Vinicia, I wonder if you could just bring Anna back in for a moment there, because Anna, I hope you're still hearing us. Vinicius there was talking about the kinds of alliances that Haddad will have to make to try and overcome and get past Bolsonaro in the second round. But what about the social movements, going back to them? Yourself, the MST, one of the most powerful, obviously one of the most powerful historic social movements in Brazil. What are you going to be doing as the MST in the next 3 weeks to try and turn this situation around?
Well, we really do believe, and that's not just from now on, it's since the beginning of this campaign, that we need to be on the streets. That's what we have been doing in the last months. In the beginning, believing that Lula was the best candidate and should be free and should be the candidate to be president. And if he was, he will certainly be winning these elections today. But in the case he could not be the candidate, we truly embrace Haddad as the candidate of the left, the only candidate who has the possibility to make the changes to stop what the coup d'etat that Brazil suffered this in 2 years ago just have provoked. So we are in the streets. We are not alone. We are together with a lot of other social movements. We are part of the Brazilian Popular Front, but we are also together with these feminist movements, with the indigenous movements. And we truly believe that now, although internet is still a very and the social media is still a camp of battle, that we need to be more present, and especially bringing a counter information, truly information that can show people that all these, a lot of offensive news who are being published about the Workers' Party, about Haddad, are fake news, are not true, but also showing them that the proposals that Bolsonaro has are truly against the workers and against the working class and against the poorest people. So internet is also a battle, a camp of battle that we need to be more present, but mainly from the part of social movements is on the street, is talking with people. We have been doing that the last days. We have been seen that a lot of people have just decided to vote on Bolsonaro, but don't have arguments to vote on him. When you ask him why will they vote on Bolsonaro, they don't know how to explain why they will vote. So we really believe that if we can just spend some time talking with some of those people, we can revert their vote. And also, of course, we truly believe that the left parties can be together with Haddad in the second round, and that we can really, on these 20 something days that we have until the runoff, that we can really make a debate about program, and to show that between these two candidates, the only one who has a really true program for Brazil, from development of Brazil, is Fernando Haddad.
Now, Anna, I'm going to ask you a question, but I need you to hold on for 2 seconds, because we have more new results that just came off the screen. So we have 93% of the votes in. I think I remember Jair Bolsonaro at 47, and Fernando at 23. I can't remember. We need to bring those back up. But I just wanted to mention it because that's 93% of the votes in. So we seem to be on track to a second round. Now, Anna, you were talking about the fact that y'all are on the ground. Okay, my results are Jair Bolsonaro is at 47% and Fernando Haddad at 28%. So we are definitely heading into a runoff. Anna of the Workers' Party, Anna Chow, I want to bring you back up because whoever wins the election after the second round is going to have a lot of work to do, which is going to be a very tall order because clearly Brazil is very fractured at the moment. What are you recommending, or what does the Workers' Party have as the solution to Brazil's problems at the moment? Because you'll have a lot of convincing to do to your populace. Anna?
Yes.
Because you're talking about social media and all of that. So I kind of wanted to talk about what, you know, if your candidate wins, what is he going to have to do as he takes up office?
You are right when you say it will be a very difficult situation. Although if we have this situation that Haddad will win, we have seen now from the results that are already defined that there is a lot of right-wing candidates who win to be senated and to parliament. So that will bring a very difficult situation for Fernando Haddad to make a government and to make his proposals to be successful. But mainly, we need to focus on developing the potentialities of Brazilian economy, developing industry, but at the same time thinking that we should do that with redistribution of the resource. So we need to make a redistribution of the profits, and we need to find a way to stop the frozen of that the COP just made. So these last 2 years, we have been a withdrawal of rights. We have been, in terms of budget, that the budgets for education, for health, for public services, mainly for the poor population, have been arrested. And so we need to reverse this situation. So at the same time, we need to promote the growing of the country, making the industry just develop again, but also look at the situation of the workers and really make the confront with the elites. And there's a lot of
Sorry, Anna. I wanted to bring Vinicius back into the conversation because Vinicius, thank you so much for that, because I think that's really important. And actually, I wanted to ask Vinicius to respond to actually the same question that I asked you. What would the candidate who wins would have to do? Now, Vinicius, you do a lot of work with social movements and with indigenous groups. So what are they telling you that they need from the government of Brazil?
Well, especially in terms of indigenous rights, in Brazil, the Brazilian state has historically a very low care about the indigenous population. And so what the president really needs is to listen to this population, to these minorities that even before, even in Workers' Party governments, they were a bit kind of put on the second level to benefit some other areas, especially agribusiness. So what the president really needs to do is to listen to these people, it's to bring them into the political arena and to make their voices be heard to the other parts of the political sphere. So this is especially important for the president, whoever wins.
Vinicius, I wonder if I could ask you, because you're talking there about listening to the social movements, the indigenous peoples in Brazil, Anna was talking about the social movements being in the streets over the next 3 weeks, trying to convince people, trying to win back some of those votes from the sort of Bolsonaro camp. But you were also talking before about the need to build these alliances with some of the more centrist candidates in their base. And I'm just wondering how much of a tension there is between those two things, you know, between building the support in the streets and trying to get that pressure out there, listening to the social movements on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to sort of pacify or build bridges with quite moderate candidates in the middle and their supporters. Isn't that going to be quite a tricky balancing act?
Definitely, and especially for Haddad, that will be very hard because Bolsonaro is more in the extreme level, and he's also very focused on economy. And this, well, the market really likes Bolsonaro. So every time that he leads the polls, or for a broader difference, like the market start to get happy in a way. The dollar start to drop, and the shares in São Paulo trade bank starts to grow. So it's very difficult, actually, these dynamics. But to win the election, I think that the Workers' Party have to be a bit more flexible with the center, and at the same time has to attract people who are really interested in social movements. They tend to vote to Haddad, that's true, but the election is one part of the game. Let's see if we can call this a game, because it's really serious things. Because after the election, we'll have the presidency, and we will have to deal with things. And the impeachment now, it's really a reality in Brazil. We had 2 in about 30 years. So the president has to build these alliances very strong, not only for the election, but also to rule the country later. It's very hard, but and the Workers' Party is what they will do now is to go and meet Lula in the prison and try to see what Lula suggests, if goes more to the center or stick to the social movements and try to make points. So in the next week, we are likely to have a clear view about what the Workers' Party will do. On the other hand, I believe that Bolsonaro will still with his policy. And as you said, it's really important to make this point. Bolsonaro is not very strong in the streets, but he uses social media a lot. And saying this in terms of propaganda, he does it very well. He's very skillful with that. We know that there's a lot of fake news going on, and in Brazil it's very popular WhatsApp. A lot of fake news circulates on WhatsApp, and it's very difficult to make WhatsApp accountable for what's going on there, because there are a lot of private conversations, so you cannot really see what's going on. It's very difficult to track down what's happening.
Brazil has clearly gone digital, and in the digital wars, Bolsonaro seems to be winning. That's what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's it. I think so.
Okay.
But because, for instance, there was a research that Bolsonaro's voters uses, 70% of Bolsonaro voters uses WhatsApp. And Fernando Haddad's only 59%, if I'm not mistaken. But it's less, it's definitely less. So they share a lot of content in media. He was very, let's say...
How is Bolsonaro in the streets, though? How is he in interpersonal relations with constituents?
All right. Yes, in this personal relationship, he's very, very... people are really passionate about him. Yeah, I had the opportunity of talking with him once and meet him at the airport. And people were crying when they were looking at him, and he was very, in a way, I had to say he's charismatic. A lot of people want to interact with him, and he makes people smile, cry. He creates a lot of emotions, and as you can see, every time that...
Vinicius, I just want to interrupt you a second, because we had very shortly, we had a map on our screens. We're going to bring it back up, where we have converted Brazil into colors. Obviously, we have a little bit of blue for Ciro Gomes.
A tiny bit, just a
tiny bit. The Workers' Party, of course, is red.
Right.
And green is Fernando. Bolsonaro. So this is what Brazil looks like at the moment.
I think it's just worth pointing out here that there looks like a lot of red there. That's essentially the northeast, which, as we were talking about before, is where Lula's social programs had the biggest impact in terms of lifting people out of poverty, and the Amazonian region, the far north. But of course, they're also the most sparsely populated parts of Brazil. This southeast central part, down here in the south of Brazil, is pretty solid Bolsonaro territory, according to that map, and which is, of course, where the big cities are, where the main concentrations of the population are.
And this actually falls in line with what our correspondent said earlier. He said to expect, so this is totally in line with what he was saying. And then if you said all the big cities are at the bottom.
Yeah, so you've got Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Belo Horizonte, Brasilia, they're all looking pretty green.
And business seem to, as Vinicius also just said, that businesses seem to respond favorably to Bolsonaro, which is interesting. So this map right now is not too much of a shocker.
Yeah. Maybe we could just get both of our guests to give us a sort of some final reflections on how surprised are you with the results we've seen today, and how hopeful are you that they can be overturned? Vinicius?
Right. I must say I'm slightly surprised, because I wasn't expecting Bolsonaro to have this very high voting at this moment. But at the same time, I'm also very surprised with the amount of abstention. We had in the last election a lot of null and what we call white votes, that are when people say that I don't want to vote in any candidate, but you go to vote anyway. And this time, this was not so important. We had 7% of this. Of course, I think that in the second round we are likely to have more, but the abstention is also very high. So if the candidates works in this area, with this 20%, to try to make them go and vote, go to the ballots and vote, maybe the election can be changed, because it's a completely new election now. We still have 3 weeks time, so the campaign will be on television, will be half and a half. Maybe this could be a plus to Bolsonaro. That could be an advantage for him, because he only had 8 seconds on television before. But at the same time, he's very comfortable on social media, and at this point, he will have to go more to television, he will have to go more to the radio, he will have to confront the dad much more. So I think that we can have some positive surprise. What's really surprised me in a negative way, so to say, to the Workers' Party, is that they lost a lot of people in the parliament. They were very likely to have Dilma in the parliament for the Senate, and they didn't. And very likely to have Eduardo Suplicy in the Senate for São Paulo, and they didn't. So there will be a very conservative parliament, is likely to be. We still have to see, we still have to wait all the voting to be done and then calculate how much each party has. But to the Senate, we have clearly a more conservative Senate.
So Anna, could I put to you the same question, essentially? How surprised are you by these results this evening? And how hopeful are you that they can be turned reversed in the second round?
We have now the confirmation that we will have a second round, and that makes us very happy and very anxious also. And we are sure that we have a lot of work to do on these next days. We really need to build a very big movement for democracy, a very big movement anti-fascism, that it is what this Bolsonaro represents. He's a fascist candidate, and that's why we need to bring everybody that we can together to say not he. And it was amazing that now when the second round was confirmed, I could hear from my window a lot of people showing not he. So there's still hope, and there's, I believe, a situation where we can really still make a very big debate on these two projects and what these two projects means mainly for the working class. On this moment, we really believe that we leave the class struggle in his kind of a highest moment in Brazil in the last years. So yes, we were kind of somehow disappointed that so many people were influenced by his messages in the last days, and he could reach 46% of the votes. But we also believe that we will have the chance now in this second round to prove that his project is a project that is against the poor people, against the workers. Is a project, a very project against all the rights that we have conquered this last 30 years in Brazil, and we really believe that there's still space to talk with all these people who are unsatisfied with politics, who are unsatisfied with all the political parties, to say that yes, there's a possibility of putting Brazil again, and the working class and the poor people could have again some winnings, and some happiness also. This is also about to be happy again, and to be a most equal country and a most democratic one. So we really are going to the streets now as Landless Movements, as Brazilian Popular Front, to win this battle, and to say that Haddad will be president in the 28th of October.
Thank you so much for that, Anna Chow. We're ending our conversation with you on a very positive note. And we're going to switch to our correspondent, Brian Mayer. I think Brian is on the line, and we need to talk to him about these results that we're seeing. 96% of the votes are counted, so the second round is confirmed. So we are essentially looking forward to the runoff election, the head-to-head between Haddad and Bolsonaro. Brian, are you there? Okay, so as we're waiting, let's wait for Brian a little bit.
I think it was very interesting what Anna was saying there, because in spite of the shocking for the left results, really, they seem to be very determined that in these next 3 weeks, they are going to do that job of getting out there, talking to people, mobilizing, and turning the situation around. And there is still that possibility, I think. There's still that possibility that whole center,
I think what's interesting is that Vinicius was talking about the fact that Bolsonaro has a very digital campaign. He's very digitally savvy, which I think worked in his favor because, of course, he was stabbed early on in his campaign, so he essentially was out of it. What would be interesting now is, now that he is healthy and can go back to the campaign trail as normal, what these 2-3 weeks, is it 2 weeks or 3 weeks? 3 weeks will be like. With him on the campaign trail and Haddad on the campaign trail, what a direct head-to-head, not just in the elections, but the 2 weeks, 3 weeks leading up, give or take, would be like, especially since you can't just depend on digital media. We're going to have to hear your comment. You're going to have to, if there are debates, you're going to have to participate. You can't call sick anymore.
Which he's avoided so far, of course.
Because you can't call sick anymore. Exactly. So, are we going to see some more of his offensive statements? Or are we going to hear him speak about not wanting to rape women, or maybe and not wanting a homosexual son? What will he be like? And then too, there's the USA effect that Brian was referring to. Is Brian there?
I think we have Brian now, yes. Hello, Brian, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Brian, we were just talking about the results. It looks like, well, it's practically confirmed that we're going to a second round. What do you make of those results?
Yeah, it is confirmed. It's mathematically impossible for Bolsonaro to win in the first round now. So it's a big relief. You know, I've been living here 23 years, and I was thinking of moving. You know, that's how bad it's gonna get. So luckily, you know, Haddad ended up with like 28% of the vote. Haddad had 28%, and Ciro Gomez split the left vote with him, though. So Ciro had 12%. If you add them both together, what we're really looking at in the runoff is like 46% to 40%, a 6% difference. And so it's now up to the left, and for all Brazilians who defend democracy, right? Because if Bolsonaro is elected, it's almost the end of democracy in Brazil. So all people who defend democracy in Brazil are going to have to rally behind Fernando Haddad. Right now, it's going to be a tough fight, but I think it's possible for him to win in the second round, especially, as you said, if they have debates.
Thank you so much, Brian. We appreciate your insight on this. Unfortunately, even though I have questions for you, I can't ask you any of them because we need to finish. We need to end this show. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for, as we dissected these really shocking results in the Brazilian elections, we are definitely going to a second round. So of course, Tell Us Your English is going to cover that thoroughly for you. So on behalf of myself, Soini Gray, and my co-host, Ian Bruce, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.